School, Father, to Lord, dig into your word, Father, Lord, to have the good conversation that we have, Father, and Lord, just the knowledge and wisdom that's revealed to us during this time, Father. And Lord, we just pray that you just help us this morning, Lord. Help us to understand. Give us that understanding heart, Father, and understanding mind. And Father, help the teachers and the students and the kids downstairs also, Father, and bless everyone, Lord, that puts in efforts, Father, and just desires, Lord, to seek your word, Father. And Lord, let us find it this morning. And God, we just give you the praise and glory for it all. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. So I heard of something this week, and you guys have probably heard of it. You guys heard of the Proverbs 31-day challenge? You guys heard of that? What's that? Long time ago? Well, it turns out there's 31 days in 31 books of Proverbs, or chapters of Proverbs, excuse me. And the next month coming up, July, there's 31 days. And so this 31-day challenge is to every day you read a chapter of Proverbs. You know, it helps you gain wisdom. It helps you learn, life skills. It helps you learn how to better please God. And so I want to challenge you guys, and I'm going to try to do it myself also, to do this 31-day challenge. To every day read a chapter out of the book of Proverbs, starting in July. So, that's something, if you guys want to do it, you can. I'm not going to come around and be like, did you read today? I ain't going to do that, but I think it'd be something neat to do. But anyway, last week, if you remember, we studied wisdom and our table manners, a little bit in parenting and not acting foolishly. And throughout all this so far, we've kind of learned what wisdom is, where to get it, the importance of obtaining it, the consequences of not having it. And through a lot of it, it's been advice from Solomon to his son that he wanted his son to have and learn from him. And so continuing this theme of wisdom in our lives this morning, we're going to look at wisdom and how to deal with people and dealing with people. Now that's good wisdom, because sometimes people can be hard to deal with. Sometimes we can be hard to deal with. We'll be in Proverbs 25. The key verse this morning is Proverbs 25:11. It says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver." Lesson objectives: to learn the wise way to deal with people, to be quick to hear the wisdom of the godly, and to yield ourselves to God's refinement. And so starting out this morning, we're going to see dealing with the people above us. In verses 1 through 5, and are honor those above you. So 25:1, it says, "These are also proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied out. It is the glory of God to conceal a thing, but the honor of kings is to search out a matter. The heaven for height and earth for depth, and the heart of kings is unsearchable. Take away the dross from the silver, and there shall come forth a vessel for the finer. Take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness." And so if you remember in the book of 1 Kings, it kind of talks about Solomon's Proverbs, and it tells us that Solomon spoke 3,000 Proverbs there in 1 Kings. But not all 3,000 of those Proverbs were recorded. I think, if I remember right, my number might be wrong. I was thinking there's 400 recorded. Does anybody know that to be true? I'm not sure. I was thinking it was 400 of them were actually recorded in Proverbs. But Solomon spoke 3,000 of them. And here in chapters 25 through 29, they are Proverbs of Solomon. They're Proverbs that he spoke, but they were copied out and they were added by the men of Hezekiah approximately 270 years after Solomon's death. So he spoke them, but he didn't write them down like the first 24 chapters. And I'd like to mention, too, if you go to...
Yeah, speaking about writing something down, if you want to know it, evidently Hezekiah read this.
Yeah.
And said, I need to have this written out for me so I can have attention to it daily or hourly.
Yep.
If need to.
Yep.
It becomes so important in our lives that we write down scriptures that are important to us.
Yep.
And then memorize them.
Yep.
And put them into our heart to use, because that's what we're going to get into, I think, here later. Is getting it into our hearts to use it properly.
Yep. And it's funny you mentioned that. My wife, if you look in the front of her, you write something down, you tend to remember it more,
Amen.
If you look in the front of her Bible, she's just got like Bible verses written all over the place he tries to write down and remember. I'm sure there's a lot of us like that. But yeah, it's a good idea. Write it down to remember it. But I also want to mention about Proverbs real quick. Often we know, and Solomon, he did write the greater portion of Proverbs, but if you looked in chapters 30 and 31, you would find that in those chapters, it says in the first verse, written by, or, so-and-so. Well, chapter 30 was written by, I believe he was a king. His name was Agur. In chapter 31 by king by the name of Lemuel. Not sure if I'm saying that right, but they each had a chapter that they wrote also, but the greater portion is of Solomon's writings. And that's what we're going to look this morning is the Proverbs spoken by Solomon, but recorded by Hezekiah. But then moving on to chapter 2, and it just kind of gives the author there in the chapter first verse there. But verse 2, I really like what he says. He says, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing. There's a remarkable difference in a sovereign creator of the universe and then feeble men, such as ourselves. Have you ever had something happen in your life where you have no idea how God's going to fix it, but somehow he does? You're in a situation and you just don't see a way out. You don't see how God can make light of it, but somehow he makes a way. That's kind of what Solomon's talking about here. And he's talking about it's to the glory of God that he does it. We've seen in this church alone, God's done miraculous things. He's healed, incurable diseases. He's healed tumors. He's removed them. And it leaves doctors and patients in awe. It just leaves them to where all we can do is just marvel at the things God does, the things that he conceals. And I love also this remainder of verse 2. Going into verse 3, it says, the glory of God is to conceal, but the honor of a king is to search. A little bit about me as we get into this here. I'm kind of a science nerd a little bit. I love studying and researching different things about science and math and looking things up. And this past couple of weeks, I've probably spent a couple hours just looking up like weird things like atoms and neutrons and protons and like subatomic particles, all this weird stuff. And for some reason, it really catches my attention. And it amazes me, though, that the scientists that they've revealed so many things about God's creation. We see so much more that the scientists find, but it never finds it all. God never reveals it all. And I also thought it was interesting, the more I searched and looked up these small particles that make up, even our bodies, the more I looked into this, the more I was just amazed by God's creation, the more I was just amazed by his wisdom and how he created all of it. And, there's some people, such as myself, I've become curious about these things and I study it, but then there's people that's like intelligent, and they figure it out. They go out and they search out the matter, as verse 2 says. The kings that search out the matter, and they begin to find answers and solutions, to a certain point. And they search far and wide. It says the heaven for height and the earth the depth. They search everything they can see. They begin to search. They look for an answer. They look for a solution. And I just find it interesting, though, that he says, but this here is good. It says the heart of the kings is unsearchable. Scientists, and they study so many things, and they find out, if you look up what they've really found out, it's a lot, but it says the heart of the king is unsearchable. You guys remember what the weeping prophet said, what Jeremiah said? He said the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? You can never know the heart. We've witnessed so many scientific developments and things that they've discovered, and man has, we've seen they've created great things. They've created great technology and with their minds, and science and math, it's used to explain so many things, but yet the heart is still unknown. I was reading a study a while back on the human brain, and they had explanations for so many different things, for mood swings, for memory storage, for photographic storage. They could explain all these things in like different parts of your brain and stuff, and but the one scientist, the article I was reading, they said that science has absolutely zero progress on. They don't even begin to understand a fraction of it, is they don't understand the conscience. They don't understand how people can have feelings. They don't understand how people can literally think a thought. They put a thought in your head. They don't understand. They don't even have anything, any progress whatsoever on that. And I just thought that was neat, because it's the glory of God to conceal a thing. God allows us to learns so much about, his creation, about him, but he also conceals, I believe, way more than what he allows us to find out. And, I'm glad he's a God of mystery. I'm glad he's a God that we have to seek him to learn more, that we have to, we're constantly in awe. We're constantly being amazed by what he does. And I was thinking, what amazement would we find in a God that has no mystery? When would we be in awe in him if he never left us thinking, I want to find out more. If we had a God that we knew everything about, we knew how he did things, we knew where he was from, and we just knew everything about it, what amazement would we find in him? But we have a God that conceals a thing. We have a God that leaves us wanting to find out more, or leaves us wanting to seek out. And I don't know, I thought those verses were really interesting. There's a lot in them there. God conceals a thing. But moving on in verses.
Also, you're talking about scientific stuff, things like that, but we should be searching the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
He's telling us there that there's a lot of things, and we were told something sometimes, we believe it, or we have a doctrine, and then, well, that's true. Let's search the scriptures and let's see if the scriptures back up what somebody says.
Yep. And it's amazing how, you search the scriptures, you could read something over again, and it applies to you in a whole new way.
Revealing something else to you?
Yeah, it never contradicts, but it's always revealing something new.
Yes.
But going on to verse 4 and 5 here, Solomon uses the example of refining metals to bring out impurities. He says there in verse 5, he says, take away the wicked from before the king, and his throne shall be established in righteousness. We ought to pray that the wickedness in our rulers, if we have any, if we have a wicked ruler, that should be removed. Go ahead.
What Bible translation you're using?
Should be KJV. Is it weird?
Yeah, because mine says to take away the trough.
Oh, that's verse 4, right?
That's what you're saying.
Wait, dross or droth?
Trough. D-R-O-S-S. Trough.
In verse 4? Yeah, that's what mine says. Take away.
He's getting verse 5.
Oh, yeah, I was reading verse 5. Take away the wicked before the king. Had me nervous there. I was like, uh-oh. I was like, I'm in trouble now. Nope, yeah, KJV. Take away the dross. But, we should pray. I was kind of, I'm going to go back to verse 4 there in a minute. But we ought to pray that the wicked, before the king is taken away, that his throne shall be established in righteousness. We ought to pray for a righteous leader. And I was thinking, not only does this apply to kings also, but it applies to us. Sometimes we need to have that refinement. Sometimes we need to have that dross taken away. Sometimes just as the silver is heated up to a liquid and that dross is removed and it leaves a sterling vessel, sometimes God puts us through the fire to refine us, to take out our impurities, to make us better suited to serve him, to make us better to love him. We need our impurities removed.
You stop and think about that. You start thinking about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. When we start thinking about that, and we start having God remove the dross out of our lives, that's our sin going away. Being removed.
Yep.
But that means we also have to follow after what he is teaching
Right.
in his word.
Yep. Yep, we got to seek him. And I was thinking, I was talking about refining. You guys ever, I'm going to use the example of a dollar bill here. You ever feel like a brand new, crisp dollar bill? And it's so like firm and it just feels good. Maybe like the corner's bent a little bit, but it's really good. And then you take an old dollar bill and it's all crinkled and it feels like a wet piece of paper or something. It's so soft. It feels like it could tear easily. That's almost like a sense in us, being refined. Have you ever looked in a mirror sometimes and you see yourself, but you see yourself not the same? You see yourself and you begin to think, man, I'm glad I'm not who I used to be. I'm not glad I'm not the old self. Sometimes this sounds a little weird, but sometimes I look in the mirror and I look at myself and I don't see me, if that makes any sense. Sometimes I look and I see me, I see my face, but I don't see who I am. I see something different. I see something deeper in me, something that God's done in me, the work he's done in me. And I just look and I almost become unfamiliar with myself. I don't recognize myself. It's that difference that God makes. It's that refining. And then in verses 6 through 7, it says, Solomon teaches to humble yourself before the king.
Amen.
And he says, put not forth thyself in the presence of the king, and stand not in the place of great men. For better it is that it be said unto thee, come up hither, than thou shouldest be put lower in the presence of the prince whom thine eyes have seen. Now that phrase there, put not forth, it means do not exalt. And Solomon's saying, he's saying we should avoid self-exaltation of ourselves before others, especially kings. He says in verse 7 there, he says, it's better to humble yourselves and to sit in the lower places and to then be invited to sit with the kings rather than to assume we're worthy to sit with a king and be asked to sit in the lower place. It says it's better to humble yourself first.
When you stop and really think about these two verses, and what does it apply to? All right, we've got a president in our United States. We have people that speak out against him all the time. The president sits in a seat where he has vast information at his hand, and he's trying to do the best judgment that he can for the people.
Right.
But we got people complaining about what he's doing, and this is telling us, don't do that.
Yep.
Follow his leadership.
Yep. That's exactly right. Sometimes we need to just humble ourselves, and we need to pray too.
Yeah.
But Jesus gave a great example of this in Luke 14, and I'm going to read these verses here. You don't got to turn if you don't want to, but it says, verse 14, it says, verse 8, it says, when thou art bidden of any man to a wedding, this is Jesus speaking, sit not down in the highest room, lest a more honorable man than thou be bidden of him. And he that bade thee and him come say to thee, give this man place, and thou begin with shame to take the lowest room. But when thou art bidden, go and sit down in the lowest room, that when he that bade thee cometh, he may say unto thee, friend, go up higher. Then shalt thou have worship in the presence of them that sit at meat with these. And then verse 11 here, if I could give this a title, this would be the title. He says, for whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased. That means humbled. For whoever exalteth himself shall be humbled, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. I'd encourage you guys. I think that's a great verse we should highlight or write down or something. But if this passage right here, verses 6 through 7, could be put any way, it'd be put, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles themselves will be exalted. I thought that was a great verse and a great teachings by Christ. And then Solomon, he teaches, be cautious before the king in verses 8 through 10. And he says, go not forth hastily to strive, lest thou know not what to do in the end thereof. When thy neighbor hath put thee to shame, debate thy cause with thy neighbor himself, and discover not a secret to another. Lest he that heareth put thee to shame, and thine infamy turn not away. So what Solomon is kind of referring here more modernly is avoiding court, avoiding taking issues or disputes with a neighbor in front of the kings, in front of the rulers. And he's saying going to the law should be a last effort to resolve that issue. And the first thing he says is we shouldn't do it because you don't know how well it will end. You don't know what's going to come up. It's funny how in an argument, both sides think they're right. Both sides aren't willing to back down. Both sides, there's no way they can be wrong. Both sides are right. And they fight, and they fight, and they fight because they think they're right. But sometimes we are wrong. Sometimes we just need to lay down our pride. Sometimes we need to open our mind to where maybe somebody else is coming from. And sometimes we are wrong. We're not always right. And we should admit that. And Solomon says if you go before the law with a dispute, and he's saying, and you end up being wrong, in front of a judge and in front of a jury, he's saying now you've brought shame to yourself. That's what he's saying there in that 8th verse. He says, go not forth hastily to strive, lest thou know not what to do in the end thereof, when thy neighbor has put thee to shame. In other words, when you're in that argument and you think you're right, you're dead set about being right, and you go to court and you're wrong, now you've brought shame upon yourself.
Amen.
Because you couldn't dispute it. And then he says also in verse, what?
Right there is a great point. And at the end of what you just said, when we find out that we're wrong, we should apologize
Oh, yeah.
and ask for forgiveness.
Yep.
That's the one thing that we should do, and we do not see people doing.
Yep. I believe Brother AJ, he preached a message one time. It was hard to swallow pills, if I remember. Saying sorry is a hard to swallow pill sometimes. You know, sometimes when we're wrong, it's hard to, you know, humble ourselves and say, I apologize, I was wrong. But that's what we need to do. And he says also in verse 9, he says, debate thy cause with thy neighbor himself, and discover not a secret to another. You know, instead of going to court, we should talk it out with our neighbor. If we got an issue, talk it out with them. Go to them. Seek or figure out what the problem is. You know, most of the time, I feel like I can comfortably say most of the time if you go to someone with an issue, they're not probably going to get aggressive, or they're probably not going to just start, you know, swinging on you or something. I think that's safe to say. Hopefully that don't happen. But most of the time you can talk it out with somebody. And he says it's better to settle the issue between the two of you rather than in front of everybody, because he says who knows what might come up. You know, who knows if you bring it to court what that other person's willing to bring up about something they know about you, something about your past, something that's a secret. Is that something you really want brought up in court in front of everybody? And in speaking of what might come up, he says also if you know a secret about the other person, that word discover there, it means betray. He's saying do not betray that person. If you have that secret on another person, maybe you're right and they're wrong. Maybe the shoes are switched around, and he's saying if you know something about somebody, you know, that could maybe cause you to win, he's saying don't betray that person. Don't share their secrets because you're going to win the argument. It's better to take the loss in the argument than to drag someone else's name through the mud. And that's kind of what he's saying there, is discover not a secret to another. And then he says this. He says, because don't tell that secret, because who knows who you're telling it to. I kind of thought of this as an example, if Brother Jesse, he went and come up to me and he says, did you hear what Brother Jalen did? And he starts, talking about Brother Jalen and things like that. And all of a sudden, I'm looking at Brother Jesse and I'm rebuking him for, now he's slandering his name. He's saying don't do that because you don't know who you're going to be doing it to. He says, lest he that heareth it put thee to shame. If Brother Jesse starts slandering a name and I start putting him to shame, and it says, and thine infamy turn not away. In other words, that word infamy, it means bad reputation. In other words, now Jesse's done that to me, and I'm looking at Jesse, and now he's got a bad reputation for being a talebearer or being a whisperer, spreading secrets.
Mm-hmm. Around. And two, that says, what made him feel comfortable?
Exactly.
What did he think of me that made him think, well, I can share gossip with this guy.
Yep.
He won't have any, like you said, that makes me look bad. And it makes you wonder, what made him feel comfortable telling me? Because that means he thinks that I'm cool with this and that I'm going to talk behind people's backs.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
One thing I learned in business, some things just better not say it.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably a lot of things.
And I don't have to always be right.
Yep.
I don't have to prove to somebody I'm right.
Yep, that's exactly right. Because, following that, what you just said there.
Our president is our king.
Yeah. What's it win you sometimes,
Yeah.
Just because one's right and what's wrong, what's the outcome? What did it do?
Better leave it alone.
Yeah. And we're going to get on that too later in this chapter.
Well, what are we seeing in the news right now? Take down the Confederate flag, take down these statues. Look, those things we put up there are part of our history. It is also put up there a part of our freedom of speech. And now we've got people trying to bully their way in to have it their way and remove all this stuff. Remove the history, remove the things that are important to the South or to the North. That's not who we are.
Right. Yep. Yep.
We got, even though we can debate these things, sit down and talk about it.
Yep.
Work it out like it says here. Come to an agreement. Meet on some type of middle ground.
Yep. Yep. You can argue all you want, but.
Yeah.
I've always said this, they can disagree with me if they want to, they have a right to be wrong.
That's right.
Yeah. It's actually me and my mom. If she was here today, she'd testify to this. There's a lot of things we disagree on, but I don't not go see her. I don't not buy her Mother's Day gifts. I don't hang out with her on her birthday because of it, just because we don't see eye to eye on things.
You know, I've got some friends that are Pentecostal, charismatic, and we've traveled around the world, around all the places together. We have never disagreed on anything because we don't bring up things we know we don't see eye to eye on.
Yeah, leave it alone. Yes, sir. Need some wisdom to leave it alone.
Yes.
The application here says, Jesus said of believers, ye are the salt of the earth. Christians are supposed to be the influence in the world that brings people to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. The writer of Proverbs had the same thought in mind when he gave us practical admonitions for our conduct in this life. At home, at work, in the marketplace, everywhere the Christian goes, he is supposed to be an influence for God. Nothing is more out of character for Christians who are supposed to be Christ-like than sinful pride and self-promotion.
Amen.
We are, as Paul the Apostle called us, ambassadors for Christ.
Yes.
By our conduct of life, we either attract people to Christ or drive them away. Which are you accomplishing by your conduct today? Illustration. Loveth to have the preeminence is still a crippling sin which thrives in the ranks of God's children. When will we learn that before honor is humility, and that pride goeth before destruction? It is such a refreshing contrast to encounter those who are not self-seeking, such as Solomon and Saul during their early days, David, Moses, and a host of other greats of the Bible. Meekness should be characteristic of great leaders. Amen. You guys got anything to add before we move on? Add, take away, subtract, divide, multiply. Exponents. Next part, not only dealing with those above us, but dealing with the person within us. Sounds a little interesting. And the first part is choose your words well. When you're dealing with yourself, choose your words well. Talk to yourself, use the right words. But in verses 11 through 12, he says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold and pictures of silver, as an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold. So is a wise reprover upon an obedient ear. Now, this verse 11 is kind of a odd illustration that he gives, but it contains a simple message. And a word fitly spoken, it means the right word spoken at the right time. And as I was studying, I was thinking, humans are very opinionated creatures. We all got different opinions, and I believe, being able to have opinions is a great privilege given to us freely of God. We're not just mindless creatures all walking around having the same thoughts, following the same code. But we have opinions. We have different ideas. It's amazing how the mind works. And I think that's an honor that's God given us. But it's too often that we tend to think we need to insert our opinion anywhere at any time. We often hear people say, speak your mind, or say what you want, or, whatever, something like that. But I would just want to say that can be very foolish. That can cause a lot of issues. There's a place and a time to insert your opinion. And Ecclesiastes 3:7, it says, there is a time to rend, a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak. Everyone has many opinions. Everybody has different opinions. And, that's a good thing. That's brought a lot of success. It can bring solutions to many problems, but only when it's a word fitly spoken. Only when it's a word spoken at the right time. And can it be fruitful? And it uses the illustration there is a gold apple on a silver picture. And that's kind of the weird illustration there, but you can just look at it as fine, what do they call it? Fine, gold, fine metals, I guess. I don't know. But it's just saying that a word fitly spoken is like that fine metals. That's what it is. There's a time to say it and there's a time to not.
I don't know if you stop and think about a word fitly spoken. As people, we like to ask questions.
Mm-hmm.
And get the knowledge of the other person.
Yep.
And as we get that knowledge, we formulate more opinions. And we accumulate this.
Yep.
But one thing that this brings out is when we talk to other people on a specific subject, they could come out and say, well, he said something that was very interesting and very true. Maybe I ought to take a deeper look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yep.
maybe I should take that and put it into some type of action. That comes from discussion,
Yep.
being honest and open with each other. If you're not going to be honest and open with people, who are you going to be honest and open with? Because you're not going to be honest and open with God either.
Right.
Because we're to love our neighbor.
Yep.
We're to love God.
And I was,
We've got to be honest and open.
yep. And I was thinking, as you said that, it just come to mind, since I've been saved and since I've started reading the Bible, I've had a lot of opinions change, in the last 6 years. Reading that Bible, you start digging in that Bible and you learn God and who he is and what he says, all of a sudden your opinions start to change a lot. I've had a lot of opinions change. But he also says, using a similar illustration there in verse 12 of gold ornaments and earrings, and he speaks of reproving. And we know that reproving is, in a sense, it's expressing disapproval of, one's behaviors or their actions, But you must understand that properly to reprove, whether it be a saved person or lost alike, that it must be done wisely. I hear people say all the time, and I'm sure you guys have too, well, I'm just going to give them a piece of my mind. Or I'm going to, yeah. Well, they say, I'm that was good. They say, I'm going to tell them how it is. We hear people say that, but, a mistimed and a misspoken reproof is essentially a waste of a time. Even if on a particular matter you're on the correct side, you're correct about the matter, and if your reproving doesn't fall on listening ears or obedient ears, what has it done? If we just go around reproving everybody just because we know it's right and what they're doing is wrong, is it edifying? Is it lifting up? Is it fruitful? Is it going to sow? It's essentially, in a sense, wasting your time. It's wasting your energy. There's a time to reprove. We got to pray. We got to seek wisdom when to reprove. And we must do so wisely. And we must also speak the truth. Verses 13 through 14. This is kind of following what you were saying, Brother Paul. And he says, as the cold of snow in the time of harvest, so is a faithful messenger to them that sent him, for he refresheth the soul of his masters. Whoso boasteth himself of a false gift is like clouds and wind without rain. So that 13th verse there, he's referring to a faithful messenger. And he speaks of the man working in the fields in the time of harvest and in the midst of the hot sun, and it's beaming down. And, I'm sure a lot of us have been there. We're outside and I don't know, maybe we're mowing or something, and just that sun's beaming down and it's hot. And he says, he uses the comparison of the working man when a cold front comes in, or maybe he drinks a cold drink to refresh himself, something refreshing, when you're working out in the sun and, you just drink a big old glass of cold lemonade or something, that refreshness that comes over. That's the feeling he's trying to get us to see here. And that same feeling is compared to the faithful messenger to his master. The sender of the message is refreshed and comforted, knowing that the message is going to be faithfully delivered. And can I just say that God is pleased when we faithfully deliver his message, when we faithfully deliver the message of the gospel. Just like a master sending a message, God knows that his good messengers, they'll travel through the rough terrain. They'll not faint along the way. They'll keep going. They'll do whatever they got to do to get that message to where it needs to be. And God delights in his faithful messengers who get the job done. We need to be a good messenger. We need to travel through the mess to deliver the message. That's what we need to do for God. But in verse 13 there, he's talking about the faithful messenger, and he's talking about the refreshness, the feeling that the master gets when his message goes out, is delivered. In verse 14, he begins to refer to false promises. This is kind of more where he begins to talk about speaking the truth. And he's talking about those who talk big but never show up. He's talking about maybe, we could use the example of being generous. He's talking about those that they talk about wanting to be generous, or they give the idea that they're generous, but they never give. That's kind of what he's talking about here. He's saying, he says, whoso boasteth himself of a false gift is like clouds and wind without rain. In other words, you see the clouds, you see the wind, it feels like it's going to rain, but there's no rain to bring fruit. There's no rain that pours down. And that's what he's referring to those who boast of themselves, that say they want to do something, they act big, but don't follow through. And, the Bible says we should not only be hearers of the word, but doers also. And I think this verse, something that spoke to me when I was reading it, and I'm not sure that it really applies to this, but whoso boasteth himself of a false gift is like clouds and wind without rain. We could almost look at this as like a spiritual calling. You could almost look at this as, a preacher or something that isn't called to preach, is whoso boasteth himself of a false gift is like clouds and wind without the rain. If it's a true gift, if it's a true storm coming, it'll bring the rain. I don't know if that's what it means, but that spoke to me while I was studying, and it seemed similar. So, but and then verses 15 through 16, he says, "Be self-disciplined." And he says, "By long forbearing is a prince persuaded, and a soft tongue breaketh the bone. Hast thou found honey? Eat so much as it is sufficient for thee, lest thou be filled therewith and vomited." And so in verse 15, he speaks of having patience. That's what the phrase there, long forbearing, means. It means patience. And much like in verse 11, when there's a time to speak and a time to remain silent, to do so, we must also have patience. Sometimes there is a time where something needs to be said, but not at that time. There's patience in waiting at the right time. And often it's not the words that we speak that persuades others, but it's how long we wait to say them. It's not what we say, but when we say it. It's the timing. Maybe even how long we wait after we say them. Sometimes there's things said that you allow the seed to be sown, and then later on it happens. Just like a farmer who plants a seed early in the year, so do we sometimes. We offer advice, and we must wait for the fruit of that advice to grow. We've talked about parents in the recent weeks, and this is much advice, or there is much advice. I ignored as a teen. Much advice my parents gave me. They thought they was sowing into me, and as a kid, they probably thought they was wasting time. They probably thought, I'm just teaching them and giving them this stuff, and Tyler just being a dummy and going out and doing it, whatever anyhow. But now that I've grown, years later, that advice is still there. The things that they've taught me, I'm now putting into practice. And so sometimes it's not how long we wait to say them, but how long we wait after we say them that we see the fruit. We must not become upset when we think others are not listening, but we have to have the patience and wait for that seed to sow. And also, we don't always have to yell or exaggerate our speech. He says a soft tongue can break bones. Sometimes the patient, gentle words of a wise man or a woman can have a great impact. Sometimes it's not always. I used to tell my mom, she used to try to force words, force things onto me, but we don't have to do that. We don't gotta try to yell. We don't have to try to pound things into people's head. But sometimes that gentle word can break bones. Sometimes it's not the words that we speak, but it's how we speak them. It's the emotions behind them. It's the feelings behind them. And then again, on self-control of our appetite, it begins talking about those who have found the honey. The honey was a good thing, but he's saying, even as much of a good thing as honey is, he's saying only eat as much. He says, eat as much as sufficient for thee. Eat only as much as you need, lest thou be filled therewith and vomited. He's saying only eat as much as you need, lest thou throw it back up. We've heard it said before, too much of a good thing can be bad. You can't have too much of a good thing. And that's what he's teaching there. He's teaching self-control, or being self-disciplined once again with kind of like table-like manners with our appetite. An application that says some parents apparently feel that the only way to get the attention of their children is by screaming and shouting and resorting to drastic measures of discipline. Some Christian communicators seem to think that being rude, crude, and blunt is the only way to get the attention of the erring. Passion and love are vital ingredients in communicating gospel truth. When you preach hell, be sure there is a tear in your voice. That's good. I thought of a story there as I read that. My mom was kind of like a yeller. She'd let me have it every once in a while. And my dad, my stepdad, I don't think I've ever heard him yell. And it was funny how, my mom, she'd carry on and stuff, and I'd kind of, just kind of brush it off. But when my dad spoke, I was like, I've inclined my ear more to him because he wasn't yelling, it's kind of saying. But there was times my mom yelled where I knew it was time to listen too, so. But illustration, it says, a good lesson in the art of communication is found in 1 Kings 19. After 6 weeks of aimless wandering, Elijah found himself at Mount Horeb, which he recognized as the Mount of God. Assuming God's silence meant approval, the discouraged prophet was suddenly stopped dead in his tracks with the penetrating voice of God saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Following his feeble efforts at justifying his whereabouts, God confronted him with 3 of his most powerful object lessons. First, a thunderous tornado ripped apart big boulders. Then an earthquake rattled the mountain. Finally, a roaring fire ravaged it. Oddly enough, these violent acts caught the eye of the prophet, but not his ear. They played havoc with his emotions, but not his heart. But God knew how to awaken the heart of his prophet by the contrasting, still, small voice. It captured the distraught man of God and sent him back to his post of duty and the work of revival in Israel. Dramatic words and actions are not always what is needed. Sometimes it is simply the Spirit-anointed, still, small voice.
Amen.
Amen.
You know, that still small voice, for some of us, is hard to hear. Because we got so much going on in our brain, we don't bother to shut it down long enough to hear it.
Yep, we're distracted by all kinds of stuff. And I don't know why, I'll chase that a little bit. You know, it's a generation, it's easy to get distracted in nowadays. I mean, you can get distracted so easily. But anybody else got anything to add before we move on here?
I think even in prayer sometimes we can tell God we're listening and repeatedly tell God we're listening and tell God we're listening and we're not actually listening.
Yeah.
If you and I were to have a conversation and I told you, all right, Tyler, I'm done, you go ahead and have your say, and then you open your mouth and I'm like, all right, Tyler, just whatever you need to say. And I know for me, when I really needed specific answers in a lot of situations, I found myself doing that in prayer, and it was just kind of placed on my heart, like, if you want to hear me, set aside a specific time outside of, okay, you prayed, you've put your requests and your heart, your desires, and what you would like me to share with you, you put that before me. Give me some time where you're not doing music, you're not doing anything, you're not sleeping, and I would just take an hour or two a day when I was really seeking, literally just to sit in quiet and just to see if he was going to speak, because otherwise it was just me constantly reminding him, I'm listening, my mind's open, my heart's here, I'm listening,
Yeah.
I'm going to speak. And it was like, what are you doing? I can't speak to you, shut up, son.
Yeah.
So that was always helpful for me, just setting aside time for him to speak to me when I was waiting to hear.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sometimes we get in our own way, huh? But this last part here is we dealt with people above us, dealt with the person within us. Now we're dealing with the people around us. And the first part is be a good neighbor. Verses 17 through 18. And he says, withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house, lest he be weary of thee, and so hate thee. A man that beareth false witness against his neighbor is a maul and a sword and a sharp arrow. Now, essentially, what he's saying here is he's saying, don't overstay your welcome.
Amen.
Essentially what he's saying in that 17th verse. It says, withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house. You know, take your foot out of your neighbor's house, lest he be weary of thee, and so hate thee. It means despise thee. You know, it's typically far better for your neighbor to see far little of you than far more of you. You know, it's typically, it's not a good thing if he wants you to leave instead of wanting you to come over. And, you know, this can apply to friendships also. A good example of this, I had this best friend in high school. I mean, we've been great friends for years, you know. And we went off to college together. You know, we was excited. We're going to room together. No parents, me and him. This is going to be great. It probably wasn't a month, and I hated him. I mean, he'd walk in the room from work, and I'd look at him, and I just didn't even want to look. I could not stand him. That happened for about a couple months, and then we finally got along. But it was funny how, you know, we began to see too much of each other, and it began to deteriorate that friendship. And so, I mean, it's true. There's a point where we can push ourselves onto people too much, or push ourselves onto our neighbors too much. And there comes a time where we need to withdraw thy foot from thy neighbor's house. And he also goes on to speaking of bearing false witness against our neighbors. There in the 18th verse, he says, a man that beareth false witness against his neighbors is a maul and a sword and a sharp arrow. In other words, he says he who will, spread rumors about his neighbor, he compares them to warlike weapons. You know, he compares them to those who bear false witness, he compares them to those who bring destruction. You know, it can destroy somebody. You know, I believe it's in, I think it's 1 Peter, or no, it's in the book of James. He talks about the tongue as an unruly member, and he talks about all the destruction that the tongue can cause. And, you know, it's easy for us to become upset at somebody and just to begin speaking and to saying whatever, you know. And my brother used to do that when we was younger. We'd get into an arguments, and whatever he could say, he would say to try to win that argument. It didn't matter if it was factual or not. But as Christians, we shouldn't do this. It causes destruction. It destroys. It's like a weapon. It's like a maul, a sword, and a sharp arrow. And then he says, be prudent with enemies in verses 19 through 22. And he says, confidence is an unfaithful man in time of trouble. Or I'm sorry, confidence in an unfaithful man in time of trouble is like a broken tooth and a foot out of joint. As he that taketh away a garment in cold weather, and as vinegar upon nitre, so is he that singeth songs to an heavy heart. If thine enemy be hungry, give him bread to eat, and if he be thirsty, give him water to drink. For thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord shall reward thee. So verses 19 and 20, they speak of an unfaithful man, and perhaps this could even be, a friend. And this unfaithful friend, he says to put your confidence in him, and troubling times would leave you in pain, such as a broken tooth or a foot out of joint. He uses the metaphor also of taking away, a warm coat in cold weather. You know, imagine, being 20 degrees out, and Jalen comes over to me and says, "Give me your coat." You know, he takes my coat away. I'm standing out in the cold, and he uses the illustration also of he's illustrating the discomfort that this confidence in this unfaithful friend brings, and he uses also vinegar mixed with nitre, which is it's kind of like a soda when it's mixed with acids, and I'm not quite sure what it creates, what kind of chemical reaction it is, but it must not be good. But
It's actually like, have you ever taken baking soda and put vinegar?
is that what it is? Yeah, okay. That's what I was wondering, but I wasn't sure. But yeah, but it's talking about the discomfort, or the not good things that comes from this unfaithful friend and putting your confidence in him. And we know he harms this unfaithful friend. It's harmful to us. It's discomforting. He's saying don't put your confidence in an unfaithful man or unfaithful friend. And he says to love your enemy. In verses 21 and 22, he says, if thine enemy be hungry, give him food. If he be thirsty, give him water. Give him what they need. And then he says, for thou shalt heap coals of fire upon his head. In other words, what he's referring to there is the burning conviction that our kindness will put on them. It's almost, what do they say, kill them with kindness, or whatever that saying is? It's similar to that. Oftentimes our enemies, if you think about it, they're simply looking to get a reaction out of us. They're doing whatever to see how we're going to react. But if we react lovingly, if we love our enemies, that leaves them like, well, I didn't expect that was going to happen. They begin to feel convicted. They begin to feel guilty about it. And Solomon says the Lord rewards that righteous action.
That's just like us and Christ. Where do we stand between each other? If we would actually picture ourselves sitting right next to Jesus Christ in our lives right now, how's that going to make us feel? His holiness and His righteousness is going to convict us of our sins and our wrongdoing. And because of that feeling, it's going to change us.
Yeah, that's a real good point. And he also teaches to avoid domestic disputes. In verses 23 through 24, it says, the north wind driveth away rain, so doth an angry countenance a backbiting tongue. It is better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman and in a white house.
Amen.
Now, we're going to have some fun with that one. But he gives this illustration of cause and effect in verse 23. And he says, just as a northern wind drives out the winds, he says, so does an angry countenance, in other words, a facial expression, drive out a backbiting tongue, or a gossiper or a talebearer. And what he's saying, don't buy into those that's spreading gossip. Show your disapproval with your face. I used that example of Brother Jesse earlier. If Brother Jesse comes to me and he's talebearing, he's spreading rumors, maybe I should express my disapproval with my facial expressions. Maybe I should, look at him like, angry or something. Give him an angry look. Let him know that that's not okay. And that's what he's saying there. To drive that out with an angry countenance. And then he says, it is better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a white house. And yeah, well, I thought of it this way. Have you ever been in a silly argument with your wife? I mean, just an argument. You know it's not going to go anywhere. You know it's just going to get you in the doghouse. It's not going to be good. You know, sometimes it's better to lay our pride down and leave the room. You know, sometimes it's better to dwell in the corner of the housetop than in a White House. Sometimes it's better to maybe go where it's not so comforting to get away from that argument.
Amen.
You know, that's what he's saying.
Just say yes, dear.
Yes, dear. Plus, a brawling woman might hit you. I'm pretty sure that's what that word brawling means. So that's the best piece of advice you'll find right there.
Amen.
And then the last passage here, be self-disciplined. And he says in 25 through 28, as cold waters to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. A righteous man falling down before the wicked is as troubled fountain and a corrupt spring. It is not good to eat much honey, so for men to search their own glory is not glory. He that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. Now that first part there, that's cold waters to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. You know, we got good news from a far country. You know, we got the gospel from a far country. And I'm going to kind of speed through this real quick. And then that next verse, he talks about a righteous man falling down before the wicked is as troubled fountain and corrupt spring. In other words, he's talking about a righteous man messing up in front of sinners. You know, he's talking about as Christians, you know, we ought to be more careful about what we're doing in the workplace. We ought to be more careful about what we're doing when we're driving. More careful about what we're doing when we're in the store. You know, we shouldn't fall in front of sinners. It gives that bad image. You know, I hate to say the word image, but it does. It gives that false image. And then he goes to talk about indulgence in a good thing is bad. You know, it is not good to eat much honey, so for men to search their own glory is not glory. In other words, you know, what's that Bible verse? You know, our filthiness is as filthy rags. Our righteousness is as filthy rags. You know, we have no righteousness. We have no glory. And so to seek that out is to assume we're something more than what we are. And indulgence in good thing is bad. You know, we need to be have self-discipline about things. And then lastly, it talks about having no self-control. He that hath no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. In other words, if we don't have any self-control, we have no walls. If we have no walls, we're vulnerable from attacks from any direction. You know, if we don't have any self-control, we're vulnerable from attacks from everywhere. We have to have some self-control. We got to be able to control our flesh. We got to be able to, you know, put away our temptations. We have to have self-control. And then the application says, humility is one of the first steps to self-mastery. The same truth is expressed in a positive fashion in Proverbs 16:32. Paul heralded this temperance in 1 Corinthians 9:25-28. The lack of it disgraced Noah and disqualified Moses from entering the land of promise. The absence of divine rule in any area of life leaves us subject to being overrun by Satan. While we often talk of self-control, every Christian knows that the reins of life are not in his own hands. Effective self-control is a divine grace and not a matter of willpower or natural strength. Christ is our strength and means of victory. And that is truth. Scripture often exhorts us to be filled with various godly virtues, which means what? How do we know if we are full of goodness, for example? Think a moment about a water-saturated sponge. If you push down with your finger even slightly, water runs out onto the table. You immediately know what fills the interior pockets of the sponge. The same is true of a person. We can tell what fills us on the inside by what comes out under pressure. Henry Wingblade used to say that the Christian personality is hidden deep inside us. It is unseen, like the soup carried in a tureen high over a waiter's head. No one knows what's inside unless the waiter is bumped and trips. Just so people don't know what's inside us until we've been bumped. But if Christ is living inside, what spills out is the fruit of the Spirit. All right. That is chapter 25.